October 12, 1944, 5:58 a.m. Formosa. A Japanese reconnaissance pilot slams his radio transmitter with shaking hands. His aircraft is banking hard engines, screaming at full throttle. Below him, through broken cloud, the ocean is on fire with ships. Not 5 ships, not 10. 8 aircraft carriers surrounded by a wall of steel and guns stretching 20 miles across the Pacific. He transmits one frantic burst. 8 carriers, 180 miles east. Then he runs. 17 minutes later, that message lands on the desk of Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome. And in those 17 minutes, the fate of 700 Japanese aircraft, every airfield on Formosa, and thousands of men is already sealed. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. The community is waiting for you. This is the story of Task Force 38, the most devastating concentration of air power ever assembled on the face of the ocean. And the story of how 12 minutes, just 12 minutes of warning, was the difference between survival and total annihilation. By the end of this video, you will understand how 520 aircraft launched simultaneously from 8 carriers destroyed an entire Japanese air fleet in a single morning. How 230 enemy planes were wiped from existence before noon. How one reconnaissance report transmitted in panic at 5:58 a.m. triggered a chain of events that made the outcome of the Pacific War mathematically inevitable. But to understand what happened on October 12, 1944, you need to understand the man standing in the operations room that morning, reading that report with ice in his stomach. And you need to understand the machine that was coming for him. Captain Toshikazu Omie walked to the plotting table. The paper in his hand was still damp from the humid Formosa morning. He read the coordinates twice. His petty officer was already marking the American position with a grease pencil on the tactical map. A red square moving west at 25 knots. Omie did the mathematics instantly. At that speed, the carriers had already closed 15 nautical miles since the sighting. They were now perhaps 165 miles offshore. If American aircraft had launched the moment the reconnaissance pilot spotted them, those planes were already in the air, already climbing, already pointed at Formosa. He had perhaps 20 minutes before the sky turned black with Hellcats. To understand why that number 20 minutes meant total catastrophe, you have to understand what the Pacific War looked like in the 3 years before that morning. Japan entered the war in December 1941 as the dominant naval air power on Earth. 6 fleet carriers, thousands of combat-experienced pilots, aircraft that outturned everything the Americans flew. At Pearl Harbor, 414 Japanese planes devastated the American Pacific Fleet in under 2 hours. In the Indian Ocean, Japanese carrier aircraft sank British warships almost without loss. In the Coral Sea and at Midway, Japanese carrier aviation fought with a ferocity and skill that stunned the world. Japanese admirals believed with genuine reason that their pilots were the finest aviators alive. They were not wrong. In 1941 and into 1942, they were probably right. Then the killing started. At Midway in June 1942, 4 Japanese fleet carriers went to the bottom in a single afternoon. 4,000 sailors and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots died with them. Those pilots, the men who had trained for years, who had flown over China, who had bombed Pearl Harbor, who understood instinctively how to fight in the air, those men could not be replaced. Japan's pilot training pipeline produced technically adequate aviators. It did not produce warriors of that quality, not in the numbers needed, not at the speed required. The Americans, meanwhile, were building something that had never existed before in naval history. Something so large, so fast, and so lethal that Japanese admirals in Tokyo refused to believe the intelligence reports when they first arrived. They were building an industrial machine for war at sea that produced carriers the way Detroit produced automobiles. The Essex-class aircraft carrier displaced 27,000 tons. It was 872 feet long. It carried 90 aircraft. Its flight deck crews could launch 24 planes in 12 minutes. Newport News Shipbuilding. The Philadelphia Navy Yard, Norfolk, Quincy, Massachusetts. The yards worked around the clock, 3 shifts, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Steel arrived by rail. Armor plate was cut and welded by teams working in shifts, so the work never stopped. A new Essex-class carrier slid down the ways approximately every 16 months. Then the schedule compressed. Then it compressed again. By 1944, the Americans were completing fleet carriers faster than Japan could track their names. Japan's shipyards, Kure Yokosuka Sasebo, working at maximum capacity, could not produce carriers at 1/10 that rate. And the pilots. God, the pilots. America had flight training schools in Florida, in Texas, and California. Young men arrived from farms and factories and city streets and were turned into combat aviators through a training program so thorough that American pilots entering combat in 1944 had more total flying hours than their Japanese counterparts who had survived 3 years of war. The Americans graduated replacement pilots the way Japan had once graduated naval officers in industrial quantities with industrial consistency. By October 1944, Task Force 38 was the result of all of this. 17 carriers, 9 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers divided into 4 task groups that could operate independently or concentrate into a fist capable of destroying anything on Earth. Task Group 38.1 under Vice Admiral John McCain. Task Group 38.2 under Rear Admiral Gerald Bogan. Task Group 38.3 under Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman. Task Group 38.4 under Rear Admiral Ralph Davidson. Each task group carried over 100 aircraft. Together, they could launch more than 1,000 planes in a single coordinated strike. This was not theory. They had done it. They had done it at Truk in February, at Palau in March, at Saipan and Guam in June. Every time a Japanese airbase that had taken years to construct was reduced to burning rubble in a single morning. Now they were pointed at Formosa. Fukudome received the reconnaissance report in his quarters at 6:10. He was a precise man, a careful man, a man who had spent 30 years studying naval doctrine and operational planning. He walked to the operations room without hurrying. Panic communicated itself to subordinates. He could not afford panic. He studied the plotting table. He did the same mathematics Ome had already done, arriving at the same brutal answer. The Americans were coming. They were already launching. There was nothing that could stop them from reaching Formosa. The only question was how many Japanese aircraft could get airborne before the first Hellcat crossed the coastline. He had 700 aircraft on Formosa, spread across multiple airfields, many still being assembled, many needing maintenance. Fuel already in short supply because American submarines had spent 18 months systematically strangling Japan's convoy routes from Southeast Asia. Against the 8 carriers detected that morning, which represented approximately half of Task Force 38, Fukudome was holding a losing hand. He knew it. Every man in that operations room knew it. None of them said it aloud. "Order all airfields to launch immediately," Fukudome said. "Everything that can fly, get them airborne before the Americans arrive." The sirens started at Tynan Airfield at 0622. Ground crews ran. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft, still pulling on flight gear. Engines coughed, caught, roared. The distinctive snarl of Mitsubishi radial engines filled the morning air over half a dozen airfields simultaneously, as 250 Japanese fighters began their desperate race to altitude. Lieutenant Shinji Nakamura was one of them. 24 years old. 130 combat hours. Good by the standards of 1944. Which tells you how far Japanese pilot quality had fallen since the men who struck Pearl Harbor. He climbed through 12,000 feet, pushing his Zero to its ceiling, searching the sky above him. He found it at 15,000 feet. Silver aircraft. Contrails streaming in the cold upper air. He counted 30, maybe more, beyond visibility. His own squadron numbered 12 aircraft. He keyed his radio. Enemy fighters high. Many aircraft. Proceeding to intercept. The response from ground control was garbled. Too many pilots transmitting simultaneously. Too many contacts. Too many emergencies converging at once across the entire northern sector. Nakamura pushed his throttle to the stop and climbed. He never reached attack altitude. The Hellcats came from above and behind exactly as their tactical doctrine specified, diving to build speed, attacking out of the sun, hitting and pulling away before the Zeros could bring their superior turning ability to bear. Nakamura saw tracers flash past his canopy. He broke hard left. A Hellcat flashed through his turn, unable to follow, but there was another one below, climbing on excess energy from its dive, and he saw the muzzle flashes from 650 caliber guns before he felt the rounds hit. His left wing fuel tank exploded. He had approximately 5 seconds. He jettisoned the canopy, rolled inverted, and fell clear at 12,000 feet. His parachute opened. Below him, his Zero spiraled into the sea, trailing a column of black smoke. The air battle over northern Formosa lasted 23 minutes. Japanese fighters shot down 9 American aircraft. American fighters shot down 53 Japanese aircraft. For every Hellcat that fell, 6 Zeros died. And that ratio, that brutal, inexorable ratio, was not an accident. It was not bad luck. It was the product of 3 years of American industrial and tactical development, concentrated into a kill machine that Japanese courage, which was absolutely genuine and absolutely real, could not overcome. At 7:20, the dive bombers arrived. 136 SB-2C. Helldiver aircraft from 3 task groups, each carrying a 1,000-pound bomb, approached Formosa from 20,000 feet. They had been assigned specific targets by strike planners working from reconnaissance photographs taken days earlier. Every major airfield, every fuel depot, every maintenance facility. The Helldivers rolled into 70-degree dives, perforated dive brakes, extended accelerating through 350 miles per hour, while pilots held crosshairs on runways and revetments below. They released at 3,000 feet. The G-forces pulling out of the dive grayed out peripheral vision. The bombs hit with devastating precision. Tainan Airfield received 38,000-pound bombs in the first 12 minutes. 7 direct hits on the main runway, 11 hits on the taxiway, 20 hits in the dispersal area where fighters were being fueled and armed. Commander Saburo Hoshino watched from a slit trench as the airfield he had spent months rebuilding was erased in half an hour of systematic destruction. Each explosion represented weeks of repair work. Each crater in the runway meant another day of lost operational capability. The Americans were not trying to temporarily neutralize Tainan. They were trying to make it permanently unusable. There is a difference, and the Americans understood that difference with engineering precision. The torpedo bombers came last. 72 TBM Avengers configured as horizontal bombers, each carrying 4 500-pound bombs, targeted fuel storage maintenance hangars and headquarters buildings. At Takao Airfield, fuel storage tanks containing 80,000 gallons of aviation gasoline accumulated over months of dangerous convoy operations from Singapore and Borneo erupted in a fireball visible from 20 miles. American pilots radioed their strike commanders with cold professionalism. Takao fuel storage destroyed. Secondary explosions continuing. Heavy black smoke to 15,000 feet. By 800, the first American strike was complete. 420 aircraft had reached Formosa. 18 had been shot down, less than 4% of the strike force. In exchange, approximately 150 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed in the air or on the ground. Every major airfield on the island was burning, and the Americans were already recovering aboard their carriers, rearming, refueling, and preparing to do it again. Fukudome received damage reports for 2 hours. Every airfield reported heavy damage. Tainan was completely non-operational. 3 runways at Takao were cratered. Shinchiku reported fuel storage destroyed and 42 aircraft lost. Matsuyama estimated 70% of its fighter strength had been wiped out. Then, at 0930, reconnaissance aircraft reported the American carriers launching a second strike. Same composition. 400 aircraft. Arriving over Formosa at approximately 11 a.m., the Americans had launched, recovered, rearmed, and launched again in 90 minutes. Fukudome stood over the plotting table and looked at the numbers. His remaining aircraft were scattered across damaged airfields. Fuel was critically low. Ammunition was running short. Fighter strength was down by more than 100 aircraft. And 400 American planes were already in the air pointed at whatever was left. This was the moment, standing in that operations room, reading those damage reports, while a second American strike flew toward him, that Fukudome understood something Japanese naval doctrine had refused to accept for 3 years. The war was not going to be decided by the courage of Japanese pilots. It was not going to be decided by the skill of Japanese admirals. It was going to be decided by the mathematics of industrial production. And those mathematics had already produced their verdict. The answer was simply taking time to arrive. But here is what Fukudome did not yet know. Here is what Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo did not yet know. Those 8 American carriers off Formosa. They were not the main strike. They were the opening move. In Part 2, we will show you exactly what happened when Fukudome ordered his remaining 320 aircraft into a desperate counterattack against Task Force 38, and why American radar detected that attack 100 miles away before a single Japanese pilot could see a carrier. We will show you the moment Japanese naval aviation stopped being a fighting force and became a sacrifice. And we will introduce you to the American commander who understood better than anyone alive that the Pacific War had already been won in the shipyards of Newport News and Philadelphia 3 years before the last shot was fired. In Part 1, we watched Captain Toshikazu Omie read a reconnaissance report with shaking hands. 8 American carriers, 180 miles east. 17 minutes of warning. By noon on October 12, 1944, 2nd Air Fleet had lost 230 aircraft, and every major airfield on Formosa was burning. But Fukudome still had 320 serviceable aircraft, and Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo was about to make the decision that would destroy them all. Here is the number that should stop you cold. Of the 180 aircraft Fukudome launched in his counterattack against Task Force 38, exactly 22 made it back to Formosa. That is an 88% loss rate in a single afternoon. And the Americans never even saw most of them coming. The Japanese pilots flew directly into a wall they could not see, could not understand, and had no answer for. But before that massacre in the sky, there was a room in Tokyo where an argument was already lost before it began. Vice Admiral Suemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received Fukudome's first damage report at 1400 on October 12th. He read it standing at his desk. He did not sit down. His operations officer, Rear Admiral Takazumi Oka, stood across the room holding a second report from land-based reconnaissance. The American carriers were still on station, still launching aircraft, still methodically destroying everything Formosa had built over 3 years. Oka placed the reconnaissance report on the desk. "We should order a maximum effort counterattack," he said. "Every serviceable aircraft on Formosa. Commit them now before the Americans reduce our strength further." Toyoda looked at him. What does Fukudome estimate as his operational strength? Approximately 320 aircraft, perhaps 200 fully serviceable. And the American carriers are at what distance? 190 miles east, moving. Toyoda walked to the map table. 190 miles. At maximum cruise speed, Japanese strike aircraft needed 70 minutes to reach attack position, assuming the carriers remained stationary, which they would not. Assuming American Combat Air Patrol did not intercept, which it would. He understood the mathematics completely. He had understood them since the Battle of the Philippine Sea 4 months earlier, when Japanese carrier aviation had launched 400 aircraft against Task Force 58, and fewer than 50 survived to return. American pilots had called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, with the casual contempt of men who had never been genuinely threatened. "Send the order," Toyoda said. "Maximum effort, all available aircraft." Oka nodded and left the room. Neither man mentioned the turkey shoot. There was nothing useful to say about it. Fukudome received the order at 14:15. He stood over the damage report spread across his makeshift operations table. The original headquarters building was still smoking from the morning's bombing, and he read the directive from Tokyo twice. Maximum effort, all available aircraft. He called Omie over. "How many can we actually put in the air?" Fukudome asked. Omie had the numbers. 180 strike aircraft, 60 fighters for escort. Fuel, sufficient for the mission, barely. Fukudome looked out the tent flap at the damaged airfield. Mechanics were still filling craters in the runway with packed earth and gravel, working by hand because the heavy equipment had been destroyed in the morning strikes. Pilots were resting under trees, too exhausted to sleep. Fuel trucks were rationing their remaining aviation gasoline with the precision of surgeons. "Get them ready," Fukudome said. "Launch at 14:30. What Fukudome did not have, what no Japanese commander anywhere in the Pacific had, was the one piece of equipment that had already made the outcome of this counterattack inevitable before a single engine started. He did not have radar capable of detecting American fighters at combat range. Japanese radar technology in October 1944 could, under optimal conditions, detect aircraft at approximately 30 miles. American radar aboard Task Force 38 could detect aircraft at over 100 miles. That 70-mile gap, which sounds like a technical specification, was actually a death sentence written in physics. The 180 Japanese aircraft launched from Formosa's damaged airfields at 14:30. Pilots taxied around crater repairs, some using taxiways that maintenance crews had patched with metal planking. Bombers and torpedo planes took off first heavy, with ordnance engines laboring in the afternoon heat. Fighters followed, climbing to escort altitude. The formation assembled northeast of the island and turned east toward the American carriers. At 14:55, the formation was 80 miles from Task Force 38. The Japanese pilots could see nothing ahead of them but open ocean and afternoon haze. Their lead navigator was calculating time to target. Approximately 40 minutes. The carriers would be visible in 40 minutes. Aboard USS Lexington, flagship of Task Group 38.3. The radar operator tracking the Japanese formation had been watching it since 1447. The contact was clear and unambiguous. A large formation of aircraft bearing west-northwest, range 104 miles and closing. Fighter Director, Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, had already begun vectoring his available Hellcats toward the intercept point. 60 F-6F Hellcats, stacked at altitudes between 18 and 25,000 feet, were turning onto intercept headings while the Japanese formation was still 45 minutes from visual range of the carriers. The intercept happened at 15:07. The Japanese formation was still 45 miles from the nearest American carrier when the Hellcats hit them. Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe was flying escort in a zero at 22,000 feet when he saw the Americans drop out of the sun. He counted 16 in the first pass, then more coming from the left, then more above. His radio crackled with shouted warnings in Japanese, all transmitting simultaneously, all useless, because there was no coordinated response possible when 60 fighters attacked from 3 altitude layers simultaneously. He broke hard right. A Hellcat overshot him, its superior speed working against it in the initial turn. Watanabe reversed and fired a 2-second burst. Pieces came off the Hellcat's wing, but it kept flying. Then something hit his zero from behind, a sound like hammers on sheet metal, and his instrument panel disintegrated. He was still flying, barely. He pushed the nose down and dove, trading altitude for speed, running east toward Formosa. Around him, the sky was a chaos of burning aircraft and falling debris. The Japanese escort fighters were fully engaged, outnumbered and outclimbed, unable to protect the bombers they were supposed to be shielding. The bombers tried to maintain formation, their pilots understanding that scatter meant death, that a coordinated attack was the only chance of penetrating to the carriers. They kept flying west. They ran directly into a second wave of Hellcats vectored by fighter direction officers, who could see the entire battle on radar, like a god watching ants. The engagement lasted 19 minutes. 73 Japanese aircraft were shot down. The surviving aircraft jettisoned their bombs and turned for Formosa at maximum speed. American fighters pursued to 40 miles from the island before breaking off. 22 Japanese aircraft landed at Matsuyama. Watanabe's Zero had 37 bullet holes in it. Several rounds had passed within inches of the cockpit. He taxied to the revetment, shut down. The engine climbed out and vomited on the tarmac. He stood there for a moment, hands on his knees, listening to his engine tick as it cooled. Then he walked to the operations officer to make his report. "They were waiting for us," Watanabe said. "They knew we were coming before we could see them. They had fighters at altitude already in position. They attacked from above. We never had a chance to reach the carriers. Not one of us came close to a carrier." The operations officer wrote this down without expression. The reason Task Force 38 could do this, the reason American fighter directors could vector 60 Hellcats to a precise intercept point against a formation they could not see, and the Japanese pilots could not know was being tracked, came down to a system the Americans had spent 3 years refining into a weapon as lethal as any bomb or torpedo. Combat information centers aboard each carrier, integrated radar data radio communication, and trained fighter directors into a single coordinated defensive network. When a Japanese formation appeared on radar at 100 miles, a fighter director officer could calculate its speed, heading and probable target, determine optimal intercept altitude and position, and vector multiple fighter groups to arrive at the intercept point with altitude advantage from the right direction at the right moment. The Japanese pilots flew into an ambush that had been precisely arranged 40 minutes before they arrived. They had no equivalent capability. Their radios were unreliable or absent. Their radar was inadequate. Their fighter directors did not exist as a concept in Japanese carrier doctrine. They were fighting a 1941 war with 1941 tools against an enemy who had spent 3 years building a 1944 system specifically designed to destroy them. By the evening of October 14th, 2nd Air Fleet's operational strength had collapsed from 700 aircraft to fewer than 190. Every airfield on Formosa was damaged. Fuel was at critical levels. Ammunition was exhausted. Fukudome sent his final assessment to Combined Fleet Headquarters that evening. Combat effectiveness reduced to 25% of pre-attack levels. Unable to conduct sustained operations. Recommend Imperial Headquarters reconsider strategy for defense of Philippines in light of American carrier strike capability. Toyota received this message in Tokyo and understood its full meaning. The airfields that were supposed to defend the Philippines' approach routes were neutralized. The aircraft that were supposed to contest American air superiority over Leyte Gulf were gone. The plan for the decisive battle in the Philippines, the operation that was supposed to destroy the American invasion fleet and turn the tide of the war, would now have to be executed without meaningful land-based air support from Formosa. Japanese carriers would have to serve as decoys, sacrificing themselves to pull American fleet carriers away from the invasion beaches. It was not a plan. It was a controlled destruction of Japan's remaining naval strength in exchange for the possibility of inflicting temporary damage on American amphibious forces. Toyota approved it anyway. There were no other options left. Meanwhile, 190 miles east of Formosa, Task Force 38 was doing something that would have seemed impossible to any naval officer in 1941. Supply ships had rendezvoused with the carriers at sea. Ammunition ships transferred thousands of bombs, rockets, and belts of 50 caliber ammunition via highline to the carrier flight decks, while both ships steamed at 15 knots. Fuel tankers pumped aviation gasoline through hoses stretched between moving ships. The carrier's mechanical crews worked through the night repairing combat damage, replacing engines, patching fuel lines. By dawn on October 13th, Task Force 38 was ready to launch again. Same strength, same capability. As if October 12th had not happened. On October 13th, the Americans struck Formosa again. On October 14th again. Harbor facilities, railroad yards, supply depots. The Americans were not just destroying aircraft. They were destroying Formosa's ability to support aircraft, ensuring that even if Japan managed to fly in replacements, those replacements would have no fuel, no ammunition, no maintenance, and no runway long enough to use. When Task Force 38 finally withdrew on October 15th, it left behind a precise accounting. Over 1,200 aircraft sorties in 3 days. Approximately 450 Japanese aircraft destroyed. Every major airfield on Formosa damaged or non-operational. Fuel storage eliminated. The American cost was 48 aircraft lost and approximately 30 pilots and aircrew killed. Fukudome submitted his final report on October 16th. He wrote the last sentence carefully because he understood it was not really about Formosa. It was about everything that came next. Unable to conduct sustained operations without major reinforcement and resupply. Recommend Imperial Headquarters reconsider strategy for defense of Philippines. Nobody in Tokyo was going to reconsider the strategy. The fleet was already moving toward Leyte Gulf. The trap was already being set. And somewhere in the Philippine Sea, the American carriers that had just finished with Formosa were turning south. In Part 3, we will follow those carriers into the largest naval battle in history. We will show you what happened when the Japanese decoy plan built on the sacrifice of their last 4 carriers actually worked and why it almost did not matter. Because in the waters off Samar Island, something happened that no admiral on either side had planned for, and no war college had ever prepared anyone to face. In Part 1, Task Force 38 appeared off Formosa with 8 carriers and destroyed 230 Japanese aircraft in a single morning. In Part 2, Fukudome launched his 180-plane counterattack and lost 158 of them before a single Japanese pilot came within 45 miles of an American carrier. Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo approved the Philippines operation anyway. The fleet was moving. The trap was being set. And now in the waters east of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history was about to begin. Here is the number that defines what happened next. Japan committed 67 warships to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The United States committed 218. But raw numbers do not explain what happened off Samar Island on the morning of October 25, 1944. What happened there defied every calculation, every odds ratio, every strategic projection anyone had made. And it started with a mistake. Admiral Suemu Toyoda's plan for Leyte Gulf was built on sacrifice from the beginning. He knew it. Every admiral in the combined fleet knew it. Japan's 4 remaining carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho Chitose, and Chiyoda, would sail from Japan as a decoy force under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. These ships carried fewer than 200 aircraft between them, a fraction of their designed capacity, because there were no trained pilots left to fill the flight decks. They were bait. Their purpose was to draw Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet, specifically Task Force 38, with its 17 carriers north and away from Leyte Gulf. While Halsey chased the decoys, 2 Japanese surface forces would close on Leyte Gulf from different directions and destroy the American invasion fleet before it could unload troops and supplies on the beaches. It was a plan built on the assumption that American commanders would react predictably. It was a plan that required Japanese surface ships to survive long enough to reach the invasion fleet. And it was a plan that on the morning of October 24th appeared to be working. Halsey received reconnaissance reports of Ozawa's carrier force north of Luzon at 1640 on October 24th. The carriers were the target he had been hunting for months. He made his decision in minutes. Task Force 38 would pursue north. He informed his subordinate commanders and turned the fleet. He did not adequately communicate his intentions to Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, commanding the 7th Fleet, protecting the invasion beaches. Kinkaid believed Halsey had left a surface force guarding the northern approach to Leyte Gulf. Halsey had left nothing. Japanese Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita understood exactly what this meant when his reconnaissance aircraft reported the American carriers turning north at dawn on October 25th. His Center Force 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato 6 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers, had survived American submarine and air attacks the previous day that sank the super battleship Musashi and damaged multiple cruisers. He had turned back briefly, then turned around again. Now, with Halsey gone north, the approach to Leyte Gulf was open. He increased speed to 24 knots and headed for the San Bernardino Strait. What Kurita did not know, what nobody in the combined fleet knew, was what was waiting for him on the other side. TF-38. That was the designation. Task Unit 77.4.3. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding. 6 escort carriers. The smallest, slowest, least armored carriers the United States Navy operated. Each one displacing approximately 7,800 tons, less than one-third the size of an Essex-class fleet carrier. Top speed, 18 knots. Aircraft complement approximately 30 planes per ship, a mix of FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers, designed for anti-submarine patrol and close air support of the invasion beaches. Not fleet defense. Not carrier versus carrier combat. Escort duty. Protected by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escort ships designed to hunt submarines, not fight battleships. At 6:45 on October 25, 1944, a lookout aboard USS Fanshawe Bay spotted masts on the northern horizon. Then, pagoda-shaped superstructures. Then, the unmistakable silhouettes of battleships. Kurita's center force had come through San Bernardino Strait during the night completely undetected, and was now 18 miles north of TF-38 and closing at 24 knots. Sprague's reaction took approximately 30 seconds. He ordered his carriers to turn southeast into the wind for flight operations, ordered every aircraft airborne, immediately ordered his destroyers and destroyer escorts to make smoke, and got on the radio. His transmission was urgent and unambiguous. Enemy surface force, including heavy ships bearing 340 degrees. Distance, 15 miles. My situation is critical. The Japanese opened fire at 6:59. Yamato's 18-inch guns fired their first salvo at a range of 17 miles. The shells were visible in flight, rising in an arc against the morning sky-colored dye in the warheads, leaving trails of red and yellow and green so Japanese spotters could distinguish splashes from different ships. The shells landed around the escort carriers in columns of water 200 feet high. Sprague had no good options. He had bad options and worse options. He chose the bad ones with clarity and speed. His carriers turned southeast using rain squalls for concealment, launching every aircraft they had, regardless of armament or fuel load. Pilots took off with whatever was on their planes. Anti-submarine depth charges, practice bombs, some with nothing at all. They attacked anyway. An Avenger with no bombs could still make attack runs, could still force Japanese gunners to track it, could still consume the attention of anti-aircraft crews who might otherwise be directing fire at the carriers. Commander Ernest Evans of USS Johnston did not wait for orders. He turned his destroyer directly toward the Japanese fleet and attacked at 7:16, making smoke and firing torpedoes at Yamato from a range of 10 miles, crossing from one side of the Japanese formation to the other, drawing fire from cruisers and destroyers, absorbing hits that would have mission-killed a less determined crew. Johnston took 3 14-inch shell hits and 3 6-inch hits in the first 20 minutes. Her engine room flooded. She slowed to 17 knots. Evans kept attacking. At 7:35, Sprague ordered his 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts into a coordinated torpedo attack. It was a suicide order framed as a tactical directive. The ships executed it. Hoel Heermann and Johnston charged a fleet of battleships and cruisers with torpedoes and 5-inch guns that could not penetrate Japanese cruiser armor at any range. Hoel was hit 40 times and sank at 08:55 with 253 of her crew. Roberts was hit so severely she broke apart and sank at 09:35 with 89 dead. Johnston fought until 10:10, taking catastrophic damage before finally going under Evans, last seen on the fantail directing fire by hand signals because the bridge was destroyed. The Japanese closed to 8,000 yards. Point-blank range for 14-inch guns. The escort carriers should have died in the next 20 minutes. They did not. Aircraft from TF-38, joined by aircraft from TF-1 and TF-2, operating further south, flew continuous attack missions against Kurita's formation. Pilots made dry runs when they had no ordnance left, forcing Japanese gunners to maneuver and track. When they got hits, the hits mattered. Heavy cruiser Kumano was hit by aerial torpedo at 7:30 and dropped out of formation. Suzuya, attempting to assist Kumano, was hit repeatedly and eventually lost steering. Chikuma was struck multiple times and fell behind. Chokai was hit and left burning. Kurita's formation was simultaneously dealing with continuous air attack, the confusion of torpedo runs from multiple directions, smoke obscuring targets, and the fundamental difficulty of identifying what exactly he was fighting. His lookouts reported carriers, but carriers that were making smoke and maneuvering aggressively and launching aircraft in conditions that suggested organized resistance. His intelligence reports said Halsey's fleet carriers were operating in this area. Could these tiny ships be escort carriers? Or were they the outer screen of Task Force 38 with fleet carriers and cruisers somewhere in the rain squall ahead at 9/11, with his ships in range of the invasion beaches and the escort carriers? Apparently at his mercy, Kurita ordered his force to reassemble. The pursuit was taking too long. His ships were scattered. Ammunition was being consumed faster than planned. American air attacks were continuous and damaging. He could not assess his actual situation clearly. He turned north to regroup. The escort carriers survived. Gambier Bay had been sunk by gunfire, the only American carrier lost to surface action in the Pacific War. 3 destroyers and destroyer escorts were gone. Approximately 1,500 American sailors died in those waters on October 25th. But the invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf was untouched. The beaches were secured. The troops were ashore. Kurita's center force retired through San Bernardino Strait. It had consumed irreplaceable fuel ammunition and ships. Heavy cruisers, Chikuma Chokai and Suzuya, had been sunk by aircraft. Hundreds of Japanese sailors were dead. The force that was supposed to destroy the American invasion had been turned back by 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, and pilots who attacked with empty bomb bays because there was nothing else to do. Meanwhile, to the north, Halsey's Task Force 38 had found Ozawa's carrier decoys and destroyed them completely. All 4 Japanese carriers went to the bottom. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force, sank at 1414 on October 25th. With her went the last operational carrier striking force Japan possessed. The numbers from Leyte Gulf took weeks to compile. Japan lost 3 fleet carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Over 10,000 Japanese sailors died. The United States lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and approximately 3,500 men. Japan's surface navy, as an offensive force, had effectively ceased to exist. The ships that remained lacked the fuel, the air cover, and the trained crews to conduct sustained operations. The implications spread immediately through what remained of Japanese naval command. Without carriers, operations required land-based air support. Without land-based air support, surface ships operating within range of American carrier aircraft were targets. The carefully maintained perimeter that was supposed to defend the home islands was broken. American forces could now advance toward the Philippines with their flanks protected and their supply lines secured. In the weeks after Leyte Gulf, Japanese commanders made a decision that revealed how completely their conventional options had been exhausted. If trained pilots in conventional aircraft could not survive long enough to hit American carriers, perhaps untrained pilots in aircraft loaded with explosives could. The kamikaze program, which had been discussed and partially implemented before Leyte Gulf, became official policy in October 1944. It was an acknowledgement written in institutional language that Japan had no remaining answer to American carrier aviation and American industrial production, except the willingness to trade Japanese lives for American ships at any ratio the mathematics would allow. The first mass kamikaze attack struck Leyte Gulf on October 25th, the same day as the surface battle. Escort carrier St. Lo was hit and sank within an hour. 4 other carriers were damaged. American commanders who had watched Japanese aircraft fly through intense anti-aircraft fire to deliver conventional attacks now faced aircraft that were not trying to escape. The defense problem changed in fundamental ways that would define the final year of the Pacific War. Fukudome's report from Formosa, written 12 days earlier in a bombed operations center, had predicted this moment with the precision of a man who understood the mathematics and could not change them. He had written that American carrier strike capability made conventional defense of fixed positions impossible. He had recommended reconsidering strategy for the Philippines. Nobody had reconsidered anything because there was nothing to reconsider. There were no alternative strategies. There was only the fleet moving toward Leyte Gulf on momentum and obligation. The story of Task Force 38 off Formosa and the Battle of Leyte Gulf is usually told as a story about ships and admirals and strategic decisions. But underneath all of that is a simpler story about what happens when one side builds 17 carriers and the other side builds 4, about what happens when one side trains thousands of pilots per year and the other side loses its best pilots at midway and cannot replace them, about what happens when radar gives one fleet 20 minutes of warning and the other fleet has 17 minutes between detection and the first bombs falling. In Part 4, we will follow the men who built this machine to the end of the war and beyond. We will show you what happened to Fukudome, to Kurita, to the pilots who survived Formosa and Leyte Gulf. And we will ask the question that every military historian eventually confronts. Was there a moment, a single decision, a different choice where Japan's outcome could have been different? The answer is more complicated than you expect. And one of the men who holds the key to it was not an admiral at all. 4 parts, 4 battles. One machine that changed everything. In Part 1, 8 American carriers appeared off Formosa with 17 minutes of warning and destroyed 230 Japanese aircraft before noon. In Part 2, Fukudome launched his 180-plane counterattack and lost 158 of them to radar-directed Hellcats that intercepted his pilots 45 miles from the nearest American ship. In Part 3, the Battle of Leyte Gulf consumed Japan's last 4 carriers and broke the combined fleet as an offensive force forever. The war in the Pacific had been decided, not in a single dramatic moment, but in shipyards, training schools, and radar rooms over 3 years of industrial accumulation that Japan had no answer for and no way to stop. But here is the question nobody asks when they study the carrier war. What happened to the men who built this machine? What happened to Fukudome, who understood the mathematics better than anyone and could not change them? What happened to the pilots who survived Formosa and Leyte Gulf, and what happened to the admirals on the American side who turned industrial production into the most devastating naval striking force in history? Because the end of a war is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is where the story becomes most interesting. Shigeru Fukudome survived the war. He was one of the few senior Japanese naval officers who did. After Formosa, after his assessment that American carrier capability made conventional defense impossible, he was reassigned to command naval forces in the Philippines and then in the southwestern area. He watched the kamikaze program expand from a desperate improvisation into official policy understanding with the same analytical clarity he had applied to every situation, that it was not a strategy, but an admission. Japan was trading lives for time, and the time it was buying was being consumed faster than the lives could replace it. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Fukudome was investigated as a potential war crime suspect, primarily regarding his command decisions in the Philippines. The charges did not result in prosecution. He was released in 1950. He spent the rest of his life writing. His memoirs and his contributions to post-war historical research on the Pacific Naval War are among the most valuable primary sources available to historians, precisely because Fukudome was a man who had understood the situation clearly at every stage and had been unable to change it. He wrote not to justify decisions, but to explain them. He died in 1971, having spent 26 years trying to articulate what it felt like to be the man reading the reconnaissance report at 5:58 on October 12, 1944, doing the mathematics and finding no answer in the numbers. Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe. The pilot who landed at Matsuyama with 37 bullet holes in his Zero and vomited on the tarmac survived the war by a margin he described in a post-war interview as entirely attributable to chance rather than skill. He was grounded after October 14th, not wounded, but transferred to a training command because experienced pilots were needed to teach the replacement aviators who were arriving with less than half the flight hours Japanese pilots had carried into combat in 1941. He spent the final year of the war watching young men with inadequate preparation fly into situations that experienced pilots would have found nearly unsurvivable. He found this harder than combat. After the war, he worked for 30 years as a civilian aviation inspector for the Japanese Transport Ministry. He never spoke publicly about the war until 1984, when a historian tracked him down for an oral history project. His account of the October 14th counterattack, of seeing 60 Hellcats materialize from altitude, while his formation was still 45 miles from the carriers, is one of the clearest first-hand descriptions of what radar-directed interception looked like from the receiving end. Admiral William Halsey, whose decision to chase Ozawa's carrier decoys north had left Taffy 3 exposed to Kurita's center force, never fully reconciled with the controversy that decision generated. He believed until his death in 1959 that pursuing the Japanese carriers was the correct tactical choice, given the information available to him at the time. The men who died aboard Johnston and Howell and Roberts, the sailors who survived Gambier Bay's sinking, had more complicated feelings. History has not settled the argument. It has only accumulated more evidence on both sides. But the legacy of Task Force 38 does not live in any single admiral's decision. It lives in what the machine itself demonstrated and what that demonstration permanently changed. The Essex-class carrier program produced 24 fleet carriers during the war. Combined with 9 Independence-class light carriers, the United States operated 33 fast carriers by the end of 1945. These ships carried approximately 3,000 aircraft into combat across the Pacific. They conducted operations from the Aleutians to the Philippines to the Japanese home islands. The operational principles developed by Task Force 38 radar-directed fighter interception, coordinated multi-carrier strikes underway, replenishment that kept carriers on station for weeks, became the foundational doctrine of American carrier aviation for the next 8 decades. In Korea, from 1950 to 1953, American carriers operating in the same task force configuration that had devastated Formosa launched close air support and interdiction missions that look in the operational records almost identical to the strike planning documents from October 1944. The targets were different. The aircraft were jets. The underlying system radar direction coordinated launch and recovery underway replenishment was the same machine running on updated components. In Vietnam, carriers operated continuously in the Gulf of Tonkin for years, launching strikes against North Vietnamese targets from task groups that would have been recognizable to any officer who had served aboard an Essex-class carrier in 1944. The Nimitz-class carriers that entered service in 1975, nuclear-powered displacing 100,000 tons carrying 90 aircraft, were direct descendants of the Essex design philosophy. Bigger, faster, more capable, but built on the same principle that had been proven off Formosa. Concentrate striking power. Protect it with radar and fighters. Sustain it with underway replenishment. Move it faster than the enemy can respond. Today, the United States operates 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. No other nation operates more than 2. This asymmetry, which traces directly to the production decisions made in American shipyards between 1941 and 1945, remains the single most defining feature of American military power projection in the 21st century. The 17 minutes that separated Japanese radar detection from American aircraft arrival over Formosa in 1944 has become, in the age of satellite surveillance and over-the-horizon radar, a problem of seconds rather than minutes. But the fundamental equation has not changed. The side with more carriers, more aircraft, better radar, and more replacement pilots controls the ocean. That equation was written in the Pacific between 1942 and 1945, and it has not been revised since. The deeper lesson of Task Force 38 is not technological. Technology can be copied, improved, countered. The Hellcat was replaced by the Corsair, and then by jets. The proximity-fused shell was eventually matched by other nations. Radar improved on both sides as the war continued. The lesson that cannot be easily replicated is systemic. The United States in World War II built not just weapons, but a weapons production and weapons delivery system that was self-sustaining, self-reinforcing, and continuously improving. When carriers were lost, replacements arrived from the yards. When pilots were killed, replacements emerged from training pipelines. When tactics failed, doctrine was revised and disseminated across the entire fleet within weeks. Japan could not do this. Not because Japanese engineers were less capable. Japanese aircraft design in 1941 was by multiple objective measures superior to American equivalents. Not because Japanese pilots were less brave or less skilled. The men who struck Pearl Harbor and ranged across the Indian Ocean were among the finest naval aviators in the world. Japan could not sustain the system because Japan had built its military capability on a narrow base of highly trained specialists, operating exceptional equipment with no redundancy and no replacement pipeline adequate to wartime attrition. When those specialists died, the capability died with them. When the equipment was destroyed, there was no industrial capacity to replace it at the rate losses were accumulating. This is the pattern that repeats across military history whenever a force optimized for a single dominant engagement meets a force optimized for sustained industrial attrition. The Mongol cavalry that was nearly invincible in open field battles could not sustain operations against fortified positions without the industrial base to produce siege equipment at scale. The German blitzkrieg that destroyed French and Soviet forces in the opening campaigns of the war eventually exhausted itself against an opponent that could replace tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. The Japanese carrier force that struck Pearl Harbor with 6 carriers and 414 aircraft had no answer for an opponent that could respond with 17 carriers and over 1,000 aircraft 2.5 years later. The men who built Task Force 38 understood this. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, understood it from the beginning. Admiral Chester Nimitz understood it. The shipyard workers at Newport News and Philadelphia, who worked 3 shifts 7 days a week, understood it in practical terms, even if they did not articulate it strategically. The industrial mobilization of the United States between 1941 and 1945 was not simply impressive. It was decisive in a way that no single battle, no single tactical innovation, no single admiral's decision could be. Here is the detail that most accounts of the Pacific Carrier War omit. The reconnaissance pilot who spotted Task Force 38 at 0540 on October 12, 1944. Lieutenant Tetsushi Yamada flying his Nakajima C-6N at maximum speed. Away from the American carriers, transmitted his sighting report, and then turned for home. He landed at Formosa at approximately 8:30. 2 hours after the first American bombs had already fallen on the airfields his report was supposed to protect. The system he was part of the warning system. The defensive network, the operational response chain was too slow by design. Japanese carrier doctrine had never fully adapted to the reality of radar-directed operations because Japanese naval culture in the 1930s had developed around the assumption that individual excellence would overcome systemic disadvantage. The best pilots, the best ships, the best torpedoes, the best swords, against an opponent who had decided that systemic capability would overcome individual excellence, that assumption was fatal. Yamada survived the war. In a 1967 interview, he was asked whether he had understood when he transmitted that sighting report at 0558 on October 12, 1944, what the consequences would be. He said he had known the American carriers were large. He had known there were 8 of them. He had known his report gave Formosa perhaps 20 minutes of warning. What he had not known, what he could not have known, from the cockpit of a reconnaissance aircraft banking away from American fighters at 375 miles per hour, was that the 20 minutes he was providing were not 20 minutes of defense. They were 20 minutes of confirmation. The result had already been determined in the shipyards of Newport News and Philadelphia, in the training schools of Florida and Texas and California, in the radar rooms and combat information centers of ships that could see 100 miles in every direction. His report did not change the outcome. It only announced the schedule. From a reconnaissance report transmitted in panic at 5:58 a.m. to the systematic destruction of Japanese air power across the Pacific to the largest naval battle in history, to the permanent transformation of how nations project military force across oceans. The story of Task Force 38 is ultimately a story about what happens when one side decides that the way to win a war is to make the outcome inevitable before the first shot is fired. The Americans did not win the Pacific War in the waters off Formosa, or in Leyte Gulf, or at Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. They won it in 1941, when they decided to build 24 Essex-class carriers and train 10,000 pilots per year, and then spent 4 years converting that decision into steel and aluminum, and trained human beings deployed across 30 million square miles of ocean. The 17 minutes between detection and destruction was never really about radar range or aircraft speed. It was about what a nation had decided to become years before the war began, and whether that decision was sufficient to overcome what it was facing. For Japan, no decision made after December 1941 could reverse the industrial reality that decision had created. For the men who flew and sailed and died in those waters, that mathematical certainty was the context in which every act of courage and every act of sacrifice occurred. It did not make the courage less real. It only made the tragedy more complete. The greatest military force ever assembled on the world's oceans was not built from heroism, though it contained heroism in abundance. It was built from steel production quotas and training syllabi, and logistics tables, and the quiet, relentless work of people whose names do not appear in any history book, doing the same job tomorrow that they did today, building the machine that made the outcome inevitable.